Most people think conservation is about saving animals, but that's not actually correct. After working in conservation for over 15 years, I realized pretty quickly it's not about animals, it's about people. It's about incentives, land, and conflict. And if you get those wrong, no amount of good intentions is going to make conservation work. Let's start with human wildlife because that's one of the biggest issues in conservation and probably the biggest misconceptions. Most people think that conflict happens because animals are aggressive or unpredictable, but that's not usually the case. Human wildlife conflict almost always happens when people begin to encroach in wilderness areas, and when they do, that conflict increases exponentially. We're seeing more overlap, more pressure, and more situations where people and wildlife are competing for the same space. Now, there are ways to reduce this. Things like fencing, compensation for damaged crops, prevention teams, and education. All these things can work, but only if they're consistent and properly managed. Because if they're not, people lose trust very quickly, and once that trust is gone, those systems become useless. And this is something that a lot of people just don't understand. Most of the conflict is happening in some of the poorest parts of the world. In developed countries, we tend to see a sort of intrinsic value in wildlife. But if you're living in a rural area of Zimbabwe or Thailand, and an animal is destroying your crops, threatening your safety and costing you money, you don't see a value, you see a problem. And that's why one of the most important parts of conservation is making sure local communities actually benefit from having wildlife next to their property, because if they don't, they will eventually remove it. Now, if we move on to anti-poaching, this is another area that almost everybody gets wrong. Most people imagine poachers as heavily armed individuals running around through national parks hunting rhinos and elephants. And while that does exist, it's not the majority of poaching that occurs. Most poaching is actually done by local people, subsistence hunters, trying to feed themselves to earn some income, basically from bushmeat. They're using snares, simple tools, and they're not usually carrying firearms, and even if they do, they're handmade and incredibly unreliable. And you'll often see a very clear pattern: when the economy goes down, poaching goes up, and vice versa. Something else that people don't realize is that many rangers are actually former poachers themselves, and while that can be a good thing, it creates a very complicated dynamic. Part of the reason is now you're asking someone to enforce laws against people they grew up with, their friends, their family, their local community, and that creates tension. And in some cases, rangers will receive death threats, not just to themselves, but to their family as well. A lot of people also forget that they're often doing this work for very little amount of money, and in some cases, none at all. On the other side, poachers in some communities aren't even seen as criminals. They're seen as providers, a Robin Hood type figure, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. And when money is made by poachers, it goes directly back into the community. So if you don't provide alternative economic opportunities, anti-poaching becomes a losing battle, and you can't enforce your way out of a problem like that. And this is where a lot of conservation really starts to break down. Bad land management creates conflict, and then the animals get blamed for it, and especially by people who are dealing with the problems every single day. The reality is, wildlife today now lives on land that is not suitable for farming or development, and animals don't neatly stay inside national parks and certainly don't understand or respect boundaries or fences. Animals move, they migrate, they follow resources, but a lot of conservation planning just doesn't take that into account. We create these protected areas, but we ignore migration routes, buffer zones, and the surrounding land that animals actually rely on. And that surrounding land is just as important as the park itself. On top of that, you've got completely different policies between countries, which makes managing wildlife across borders even more complicated. Then there's the issue of priorities. Funding is often misallocated. In some places, a huge amount of money goes into research, while real problems which are actually happening on the ground get ignored. Bureaucracy is also another major issue. Conservationists often spend far more time in meetings, filling out paperwork, and navigating systems than actually doing meaningful work in the field. I personally have had to spend huge amounts of time in the office trying to organize meetings and trying to get the right permits just to be able to get out into some areas, and it just becomes exhausting. And then there's the human side of conservation itself. Egos. Environmental organizations are constantly competing for funding, not amongst themselves or each other, but also with humanitarian organizations and other welfare NGOs. Of all the funding that gets donated each year, approximately only 5% goes towards animals, and less than 1% of that goes towards the environment and conservation. As a result, most wildlife NGOs, instead of working together for a common good, end up fighting each other and working against each other. And all of this adds up because at the end of the day, conservation isn't failing because people don't care. It's failing because the systems around it aren't working the way that they should. So when people talk about conservation as just saving animals, they're completely missing the big picture. Because conservation isn't about animals, it's about people, incentives, and how we manage land. If wildlife is costing people their livelihoods, they will remove it. If land isn't managed properly, conflict will increase. And if priorities are wrong, no amount of funding is going to fix the problem. When you get those things right, conservation works. When you don't, it fails. And most of the time, it fails for reasons people don't even realize. So on this channel, I'm going to be breaking down real wildlife situations, conservation issues, and what's actually happening on the ground, not just what people think is happening. Thank you for watching.